Do US contractors working in Canada trigger payroll registration? On paper, contractors should not trigger payroll registration. Payroll is for employees. Contractors invoice you and handle their own tax. That is the simple story US companies like to believe. The reality is more nuanced. Whether US contractors working in Canada trigger payroll registration depends less on the label in the contract and more on how the relationship actually works, how often they are in Canada, and who really controls the work. If the relationship looks like employment under Canadian rules, payroll can come into play even if the contract calls them independent contractors. Why labels alone do not decide anything? Calling someone a contractor does not automatically keep payroll out of the picture. Canadian authorities look at control, integration, financial risk, and ownership of tools. If you set the hours, direct the day-to-day tasks, require exclusivity, supply the equipment, and treat the contractor like internal staff, the relationship can be reclassified as employment. Once that happens, the payments you thought were contractor fees become deemed employment income. At that point, the foreign company can be held responsible for source deductions it never made. That is what turns a no payroll plan into a payroll problem after the fact. When contractors do not usually trigger payroll registration. If you are hiring a US contractor who occasionally flies into Canada for short projects, carries on business in their own name, invoices multiple clients, uses their own tools, and clearly bears business risk, Canada is more likely to see them as running their own business. In that situation, they are responsible for handling their own tax, and your company does not register as an employer just because you pay them. The same is often true for specialized consulting firms that send team members into Canada from time to time. They are independent businesses, not your employees. You have obligations around permanent establishment risk and possibly other types of Canadian withholding in some structures, but not standard payroll registration just because of their presence. Red flags that point toward employment? The trouble starts when a contractor looks like the only person doing your work in Canada and behaves almost exactly like an employee. That includes scenarios where they work for you full-time, report only to your managers, follow your internal schedules and policies, and have little or no real business risk of their own. If that person is based in Canada and doing the work there, the risk of reclassification as an employee grows. Once they are seen as an employee, your company is expected to withhold Canadian income tax and social contributions on their pay, which means payroll registration is suddenly on the table. Regular work in Canada can change the analysis. Another variable is how often the contractor physically works in Canada. Occasional short visits are one thing. Regular long-term work in Canada tied to a predictable schedule and Canadian customers is something else. The more their calendar shows a recurring Canadian presence, the easier it is for authorities to argue that both the contractor and the foreign business have real ties to Canada that go beyond occasional cross-border travel. That matters not only for employment status analysis, but also for questions about whether your business is now carrying on business in Canada or has a taxable presence. Contractors versus employees as you scale. Using contractors can make sense when you are exploring the Canadian market or need highly specialized skills for a limited time. As work becomes more regular and central to your Canadian revenue, continuing to rely on one or two contractors who behave like employees becomes riskier. At that stage, many foreign companies either convert key contractors into employees and register for payroll, or they move those roles into a Canadian employer of record arrangement. Both options bring payroll out into the open instead of leaving it buried in contractor invoices. How an employer of record changes the picture. An employer of record (EOR) model is one way to avoid building your own payroll infrastructure while still treating people as employees for Canadian purposes. Under that model, a Canadian intermediary becomes the formal employer, puts the worker on its own payroll, handles tax and social contributions, and leases the worker back to your company. When the EOR is the legal employer, the payroll account and related obligations sit with them, not with you. You still need to think about permanent establishment risk and other cross-border issues, but you are not the one registering as an employer just to pay one person in Canada. What happens if Canada reclassifies your contractors? If Canada decides that your contractor is actually an employee, the authority can assess you for unremitted payroll deductions, plus interest and penalties. It may give credit for tax the individual has already paid, but that does not always cancel your exposure. You may also have to issue corrected reporting slips and fix historical records. This is why relying on contractor status as your only strategy to avoid payroll registration is dangerous. It works until someone reviews the facts and comes to a different conclusion. Final thoughts. US contractors working in Canada do not automatically trigger payroll registration. Genuine independent contractors who run their own business, take on risk, and only occasionally work in Canada generally do not push you into Canadian payroll. The risk appears when you rely heavily on one or two individuals who look and act like employees, live in Canada, and do most of your Canadian-facing work. If that describes your situation, it is worth asking whether you are still in contractor territory or whether it is time to formalize things through Canadian payroll or an employer of record model. For more practical guidance presented in the same straightforward way, you can explore www.theaccountingandtax.com. If you require assistance with Canadian tax matters, our team is ready to provide reliable professional support. Please contact us at 416-283-8774 or visit theaccountingandtax.com for more information. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.